Alexander Orloff was a man whose life passed like a pattern on an old carpet, dark and light threads intertwined in a complex but fascinating pattern. A 70-year veteran, he lived in the small town of Veresk, which was nestled at the foot of the mountains. The dilapidated houses with peeling paint, neglected yards with rusty swings, and quiet streets lit by the dim light of old lanterns gave the feeling of a place where time had stopped. Alexander lived in a two-room apartment on the first floor of a 5-story building. His dwelling was like a time capsule, wallpaper faded from time, an old rug on the wall, and furniture that had seen better days during the Soviet era. His cat Boris, the fluffy red-haired old-timer of the apartment, stretched out on the windowsill. Boris was more than just a pet. He was the only living creature who shared Alexander's loneliness. Every morning Alexander started with the same ritual. Rising from the hard couch, he would go to the kitchen, where boiling water was already whistling on an old enameled kettle. 2 cups of strong black coffee, a newspaper, and the sounds of an old radio. That was his invariable morning schedule. "You can't open your eyes without coffee," he muttered to himself as he looked at the shabby wallpaper in the kitchen. His life was measured and monotonous. His days were spent reading newspapers, playing chess with his neighbor Ivan Nikolaevich, and taking leisurely walks to the nearest store. There the sales clerk Lydia Pavlovna always gave him a warm smile and a few words about how life in the town was getting harder and harder. Alexander nodded in agreement, but did not go into discussions. He knew the world had changed a long time ago, and not for the better. His past held many stories, but he rarely shared them. Once, in his youth, he had served in hot spots, where death walked beside him like an old acquaintance. Scraps would pop up in his memory, gunshots, screams, faces of comrades who did not return home. Then he believed in justice, in the fact that good always wins. But the years erased this faith, leaving only silent pain and memories. The hardest memory Alexander carried in his heart was of his family. He lost his wife and daughter in an automobile accident 20 years ago. That day divided his life into before and after. Valentina and Olga had been his joy, his meaning. Their loss left a deep wound that never healed. He kept their pictures on his bedroom wall, and every night before he went to bed he talked to them as if they were still there. At such moments, Boris the cat seemed to understand his master. He came over, rubbed his feet, and purred softly, as if trying to comfort him. Alexander stroked him, feeling the coldness leave his heart a little. "Well, Boris, it's just you and me against the whole world," he would say, and the cat would answer him with its melodious purr. Sometimes Alexander sat on the balcony and looked out over the courtyard. There on the playground, young people were laughing loudly, smoking and chatting on the phone. "Young people are so loose these days, no shame, no conscience," he grumbled. But in his heart, he did not condemn them. He realized that times had changed, that they lived in a different world where old values no longer mattered. One evening, when his apartment was completely silent, there was a woman's scream from the courtyard. Alexander shuddered, his heart sank. He went to the window and saw 3 guys surrounding a young girl. She tried to break free, but the forces were unequal. The guys were laughing and teasing, and passers-by hurried past, not wanting to interfere. Where is this world going? Alexander thought, his hands clenched into fists. He remembered the shotgun that hung on his wall. An old, hunting gun, not fired for a long time, but still a real weapon. He remembered how he had always stood up for the weak when he was young, and his heart snapped. Can you ever be who you were again? He whispered to himself. In that silence and anticipation, something inside him clicked. He felt the old fire that had long since died out begin to smolder in his soul. He didn't know what awaited him next, but he realized one thing. He couldn't stay away. His life was already too long to fear for himself, but still important enough to try to make a difference. The night over Veresk was dark and silent, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Only the occasional sound of footsteps broke the silence. But this evening did not promise to be ordinary. Alexander Orloff, who had just finished reading the evening paper, was about to go to bed. But a woman's scream, which broke the silence of the night, made him freeze. His heart beat faster, and the blood rushed to his face. He hurried to the window to see what was going on. Downstairs, right below his windows, 3 guys surrounded a young girl. Her eyes were darting from side to side, terror in them. She tried to break free, but one of them grabbed her roughly by the arm, while the others only taunted, encouraging their comrade. Passers-by seemed to have turned into shadows that were unwilling to notice what was happening. One man, quickly shifting his gaze to the sidewalk, quickened his steps. A young guy wearing headphones, looking at his phone, didn't even turn his head. The girl screamed, "Let me go!" But her voice was lost in the indifference of those around her. Alexander's hands were trembling. Suddenly he felt helpless. He remembered how years ago in the service, he had been someone who was not afraid to take risks to save others. But now he faced the question, what could an older man do against three young and obviously strong guys? He shook off his doubts. Without thinking any more, Alexander headed for the wall where his hunting rifle hung. It was old, covered with dust, but still quite strong. He took it in his hands, feeling the familiar heaviness. Images of the past flashed through his mind, comrades, dangerous missions, the spirit that would not let him back down. Throwing on his jacket, he left the apartment. The entryway smelled damp and old rags, but Alexander hardly noticed it. He focused only on one thing, on saving the girl. In the courtyard, the hooligans were still continuing their bullying. One of them pulled the girl's hair, making her scream even louder. Alexander didn't waste any time. He stepped closer so that they could see him, and in a firm voice said, "Hey you, let her go while you're still in one piece." The boys turned around. At first there was only mockery in their eyes, but when they noticed the gun in the old man's hands, the laughter became uncertain. One of them, tall and thin, took a step forward. "Did you, grandfather, bring the gun from the museum? You think you scared us?" He grinned, but there was already a note of irritation in his voice. Alexander raised the gun, pointing it at the sky. "Now we'll see if he did or not." He pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The gun jammed. The boys, seeing this, laughed even louder. One of them reached for the girl, smirking. "That's it, Grandpa, you've had enough. Now we'll deal with you." But Alexander was not going to give up. His face became stern, and his hands, despite the trembling, acted confidently. He pulled the bolt with a sharp movement, and the gun finally fired. The bullet whistled and struck the wall next to one of the boys. He froze, eyes wide with fear. The girl, taking advantage of the moment, rushed to the side and ran. The others, finally realizing that the situation had become dangerous, scattered, leaving their comrade, who stood pale as chalk. Alexander lowered the gun. His heart was pounding, his ears were ringing. He wanted to call out to the girl, to make sure she was all right, but she had already disappeared into the darkness. He was alone in the middle of the courtyard, surrounded by silence and the smell of gunpowder. Seconds dragged by as he tried to realize what had just happened. But the loneliness didn't last long. Flashing lights flashed on the horizon. One of the neighbors called the police. Soon uniformed men ran into the yard, their faces serious. One of them approached Alexander and said firmly, "Guns on the ground, hands behind your head." Alexander obeyed. There was no fear or regret in his eyes. He knew he had done the right thing, even if now he would have to answer for his actions. The shriek of sirens split the silence of the night. The red and blue flashes of flashing lights reflected in the windows of the houses, painting the courtyard with ominous shadows. Alexander stood in the middle of the yard, leaning heavily on his hunting rifle. His hands trembled, but he did not let go of the weapon. The girl managed to run away, and the hooligans disappeared in the darkness, leaving him alone in the face of the police. "Guns on the ground, hands behind your head," came the officer's firm voice. Alexander silently obeyed. He slowly lowered the gun to the ground, straightened up, and clasped his hands behind his head. It was strange to him to realize that he now looked like a criminal himself. His eyes, however, remained calm. There was no fear or remorse in them, only weariness. "You're under arrest for discharging a firearm in a public place," the policeman continued, stepping closer. He deftly snapped the handcuffs on Alexander's wrists. "I tried to help," Alexander squeezed out, but his voice was drowned out in the noise and radio chatter. The cops acted quickly, as if this were a familiar scenario. They put him in the patrol car, and the cold metal of the handcuffs dug into his skin. At the station, where the air smelled of cheap coffee and paper, Alexander was seated at an interrogation table. In front of him sat a young investigator with a piercing stare and a stern expression. "Name?" he asked briefly, writing something down in a folder. "Alexander Orloff," the veteran replied calmly. "Age?" 70. The investigator raised an eyebrow as he looked him over. A man of that age with a gun in his hands. It was clearly out of the ordinary. "Tell me what happened," he continued, keeping his eyes on the notes. Alexander recounted everything from the girl's scream to the shot in the air. His voice was even, without emotion, but there was sincerity in his words. "Do you realize that using a firearm in a public place is a violation of the law?" The investigator asked coldly. "And do you realize that someone had to help her?" Alexander replied, looking directly into the young man's eyes. "If I hadn't gotten out, how would it have ended?" The investigator averted his gaze, but wrote down something in a folder. Alexander felt that his words didn't accomplish their purpose. This was a machine of the system, and it was not interested in human emotions or motives. A few hours later, he was transferred to a pretrial detention cell. A gray, cold room with a metal bunk and dim light. Alexander sat on the hard mattress, leaning against the wall. Thoughts swirled in his head, but he couldn't grasp any of them. The next day the trial began. The hall was filled with people, journalists, witnesses, random spectators. Alexander stood in the defendant's cage, feeling dozens of stares. The prosecutor, a man with a dry face and a voice that seemed deliberately stern, began his speech. "Distinguished members of the court," he began, "before you is a defendant who, armed with a hunting rifle, opened fire in a residential neighborhood. Yes, he may have been trying to prevent a conflict, but the law is the law. His actions jeopardized the lives of those around him." Alexander listened, clenching his hands into fists. The prosecutor's words sounded as if he was a criminal, ready to do anything for his own gain. Then his defense came forward. The lawyer, a woman with a soft voice, tried to convey to the court that Alexander had acted in a state of extreme necessity, protecting another person. Her speech was sincere, but seemed to fall short of the strict standards of the law. "My defendant is a veteran, a man who has spent his life helping others. His actions were not motivated by malice, but by a desire to protect the innocent," she concluded. The judge, an elderly woman with a tired face, listened attentively to both sides. Her eyes were tired, as if she had seen too many of these cases. When the time came for the verdict, the hall held its breath. Based on the evidence presented, the judge began, "The court finds Alexander Orloff guilty of exceeding self-defense measures. The sentence is 3 years in a general security colony." The hall murmured. Someone shrieked, someone whispered. Alexander remained standing still. He knew that he had done the right thing, even if it cost him his freedom. His gaze was directed forward, but his thoughts hovered far away from here. He remembered that girl's eyes, her fear and gratitude, and that was enough for him to accept his path. The prison gates closed rattlingly behind Alexander Orloff's back, as if the point in a sentence had been set too abruptly and without further ado. The cold air, mixed with the smell of dampness and iron, hit him in the face. A long corridor stretched ahead, lit by bright lamps that made the walls even more gray and featureless. The guard tossed briefly, "Follow me," and stepped forward without turning around. Alexander followed him in silence. The walls were painted with obscenities, but even these traces of human individuality looked lost in this gloomy, soulless environment. Along the corridors he could hear the voices of the prisoners, sometimes cheerful, sometimes angry, but all of them merged into a deafening noise that pressed on his ears. His new cell was small, designed for 4 people. There was a bunk bed in the corner and a dirty table by the window, covered in tea stains and ash marks. The window itself was a pitiful sight, a narrow slit with a grate that barely let in any light. His cellmates were different. A tall, thin man with a wary look, a silent, stiff man who only nodded a greeting, and a third, a massive man with a shaved head who grinned and said, "Well, Grandpa, welcome to hell." He later learned that the man's name was Sultan. Sultan turned out to be not just a bully, but a real leader among the prisoners. His loud voice and heavy hand quickly made Alexander realize who made the rules here. The first days passed like a blur. The order was strict: rise at 6 in the morning, formation, breakfast, work, lunch, work again, and so on until the evening. Every minute was scheduled, and in this strict regime there was no room for freedom or personal space. Sultan quickly noticed the new neighbor. On the first evening, sitting at the table, he rudely called Alexander. "Hey, grandfather, who are you in life?" Alexander looked at him calmly, assessing the situation. His past had taught him restraint, but it was different here. "Nobody," he answered briefly, turning back to his food. The answer didn't sit well with him. The Sultan stood up, stepped closer, and leaning in, spoke softly. "Listen, grandfather, we have our own rules here. If you want to survive, you'll have to obey." Alexander did not answer, and that was his first mistake. The very next day, he felt what it meant to be a target. The Sultan and his cronies began their inspections. They stole his rations, pushed him in the corridors, threw the hardest tasks at him. But Alexander did not give up. His silence and persistence quickly began to irritate Sultan. He became more aggressive, trying to break the new prisoner. Amidst this hostility, one bright figure appeared, Igor. The young fellow, convicted of fraud, had kept away from everyone, but, seeing how Alexander was coping with Sultan's attacks, approached him in the dining room. "Grandfather, you're tough," he said, holding out his hand. Alexander looked at him, saw the sincerity in his eyes, and responded to the handshake. Igor became the only person Alexander could talk to. They shared stories, sometimes they were silent, just sitting next to each other, but this silence was warmer than any conversation. Through him, Alexander began to see that even in this hell there was still humanity. The tension with the Sultan, however, was growing. One evening, when the prisoners were going to bed, he came up to Alexander and threw out, "Grandfather, do you think you are the smartest? We'll see how you sing tomorrow." Alexander answered nothing, but a feeling was growing in his soul that tomorrow something would really happen. The next day, while working in the workshop, Sultan tried to start a fight. He deliberately bumped into Alexander, trying to provoke him. But Alexander, despite his age, managed to dodge and responded with a short but strong blow. This was the beginning of the real conflict. The prisoners ran to see, but the guards quickly separated them, threatening them with punishment. This confrontation did not solve the problem, but it made Alexander realize that he would not give up. Every night, lying on the hard bed, he remembered his past, the hot spots, the loss of his family, his old life. These thoughts were like a shield that helped him hold on. He realized that the world, even as cruel and unfair as it was, still had glimmers of goodness in it. The important thing was not to let those glimmers fade. The prison corridors, narrow and cold, stretched like an endless labyrinth where time lost its meaning. Alexander Orlov was used to their metallic echo, but on this day the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Sultan, the local leader among the prisoners, kept a predatory gaze on him. He was a man who never let a grievance go unanswered. The Sultan seemed omnipotent in this small world. His tall stature, powerful shoulders and cold, piercing gaze inspired fear. He had his own retinue, 3 faithful dogs who fulfilled his slightest whims. And today their target was Alexander. In the morning at breakfast, the first incident occurred. Sultan came to the table where Alexander was sitting, and with a smirk pushed him with his shoulder. "Well, grandfather, how did you sleep? Or have you already forgotten who is the master here?" He threw, eliciting ridicule from his henchmen. Alexander did not answer. He only looked at the Sultan with a calm but firm gaze. It was as if he were saying, "I have seen more than you can imagine." But this only made Sultan angry. "Are you deaf?" His voice grew louder, attracting the attention of the other prisoners. Alexander stood up, trying to hold himself steady, though he felt his insides tighten. It was clear to him that this day was not going to go quietly. While working in the workshop, Sultan again arranged a provocation. He deliberately knocked off the workbench tools, which Alexander had just neatly laid out. "Oh, grandfather, sorry. My hands are crooked," he smirked, leaning over Alexander. "Maybe you need help cleaning up." This time Alexander did not hold back. His voice, loud and harsh, broke the silence. "Sultan, if you're looking for a problem, you'll find it right now." The workshop froze. The other prisoners sitting at their workstations stopped what they were doing. All eyes were fixed on the 2 men who were facing each other. Sultan grinned, but there was a spark of rage in his eyes. "You were wrong, grandfather," he said quietly. "You found the problem." And that evening the problem did find Alexander. In the shower room, where he went after work, the light was dim and the water was barely warm. Alexander washed himself, trying not to pay attention to the flickering shadows and voices around him. But suddenly he felt something heavy fall on his back. He fell, barely managing to put his arms out in time to avoid hitting his head on the tile. The Sultan stood over him, his face twisted with rage. He held a homemade baton in his hands. The other prisoners watched in silence, some with interest, some with concern. Some turned away so as not to see what would happen next. "Did you think you could yap at me?" Sultan wheezed, raising his baton for another blow. But at that moment something happened. One of the prisoners, Igor, a young fellow whom Alexander knew only casually, rushed between them. "Enough!" he shouted. "This is too much, Sultan. Have you lost your nerve?" The Sultan stopped, surprised. His entourage was confused, not knowing how to react. Igor stood blocking his way toward Alexander, his face white with fear, but he didn't move. "Get out of my way," Sultan bellowed, but Igor didn't back down. At that moment, guards ran into the shower room. One of them ordered loudly, "Everybody back. What's going on here?" Sultan threw his baton on the floor and stepped back, waving his arms. "Nothing, warden. Just talking." The guards inspected the shower room and, seeing that Alexander was having trouble getting up, ordered him to go to the infirmary. Igor went along with him, supporting him under his arm. That night, lying in his bunk, Alexander felt for the first time in a long time that he was not alone. In this place where there seemed to be no room for kindness, someone had risked standing up for him. And that was more important to him than any victory. The next day, while Alexander was still recovering, the warden brought him a letter. It was unexpected. His name was written in neat handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a note. "Hello, Alexander. This is Angelina, the girl you rescued. I'm sorry I didn't write sooner. I found out what happened to you, and I want to thank you. You are a real hero, and your act changed my life. Please hang in there. I believe that justice will be served and you will come home. Don't give up. You are not alone. Sincerely, Angelina." Alexander's heart squeezed at the warm words. He reread the letter again and again, feeling a long-forgotten hope ignite inside. Angelina's words became for him a saving ray of light, giving him strength to fight on. He didn't know what his next step would be, but one thing was certain: he was no longer alone. The morning began as usual. The metallic creak of the door, the heavy voice of the warden, the command to get up and go for inspection. Alexander Orlov, as always, calmly and silently prepared for a new day, but something in the air today was different. It was a feeling as if something important was approaching. At lunchtime, when the prisoners were gathering in the dining room, the warden called out loudly to him. "Orlov!" To the warden. "Quickly!" Alexander, taking his time, got up, feeling the stares of the others. He calmly followed the warden, trying to understand what awaited him. As he passed the corridors, familiar to every scratch on the wall, he felt the tension rising in his chest. The chief's office was spacious, with a massive oak desk and windows that looked out into the courtyard. Behind the desk sat Viktor Andreevich, the chief of the colony, a man with a cold stare and a short haircut. This time his face expressed not sternness, but something like tired understanding. "Have a seat, Orlov," he suggested, pointing to the chair opposite. Alexander sat down, trying to keep outwardly calm, although inside everything was boiling. "I have news for you," Viktor Andreevich began. "The case has been reconsidered. Taking into account your behavior and new circumstances, it was decided to release you early." These words sounded like thunder. Alexander blinked, trying to comprehend what he had heard. "When?" he asked briefly. "Tomorrow," answered the chief. "So get ready." Alexander nodded, but there were no words. His mind was busy trying to understand what the news meant. Years behind barbed wire had almost erased his faith in justice, but this moment was a turning point for him. The next day's morning procedures were particularly tense. The prisoners watched in silence as Alexander gathered his belongings. Among them was Igor, a young boy who had become something of an ally to him in recent months. He walked over, held out his hand, and said quietly, "Hang in there, Alexander. It'll be easier outside." Alexander shook his hand and replied briefly, "Thank you, Igor. Take care of yourself." As he walked across the courtyard, the prisoners silently followed him with glances. Some whispered, some nodded, but most just looked at him with respect. To them, he was more than just a prisoner. He was an example that even in the harshest of conditions, one could remain human. When the massive gate slammed shut behind him, Alexander stopped, breathed deeply of the fresh air, and felt his heart fill with lightness for the first time in a long time. The world outside the colony was bright and noisy and alien, but there was freedom in it. At the gate, Angelina was waiting for him. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she was smiling. She ran up to him, hugged him tightly, as if she was afraid that he would disappear again. "Hello, Alexander," she whispered, not letting him go. "Hello, Angelina," he answered, and his voice trembled. "Thank you for not forgetting." They stood for a long time, embraced, paying no attention to passers-by. It was a moment that meant for both of them the beginning of a new life. Later, in a small cafe, they sat at a table by the window. Angelina told about how she had fought for his release, about the letters she had written to various authorities, and about the people who had helped her. Alexander listened, occasionally nodding, but in his eyes read gratitude. "You know, Angelina," he said, when she was silent, "I thought I had lost faith in people, but you proved to me that kindness still exists. Thank you." She smiled and squeezed his hand. "And I thought it was you who restored my faith in justice, Alexander. Your act changed not only my life, but also my attitude to the world." These words were the last straw for Alexander, which broke down the wall built by years of loneliness. He realized that his actions mattered, that his struggle was not in vain. Alexander Orlov started a new life. He rented a small apartment in the same town where Angelina lived and began helping out at a local NGO that was dedicated to protecting people's rights. His experience and wisdom became a valuable resource for many. Sometimes he visited Igor, who still remained in the colony. These meetings were a reminder to both of them that even in the most difficult conditions, human dignity can be preserved. One day, returning home after another meeting with Angelina, he stopped at a park. A light wind was moving the leaves of the trees. Children were laughing, playing on the playground. Alexander smiled, feeling the warmth in his chest. He realized that life went on, and that there were still many moments worth living. Now he knew that faith in people and ideals is what gives you the strength to go forward, even when it seems that the whole world is against you.